I would recommend if you're in a shared environment like that, that you don't use the same Wi-Fi across the different companies that are sharing that network, that you segregate the different devices.
You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I am Sherry Lip, Marketing Director at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here today with Stimulus Technologies CEO Nathan Whittacre. And today we are talking about businesses that require field offices like construction and engineering and what that means for cybersecurity. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to the podcast today.
So we talked a little bit about field offices when it comes to internet a while back on the podcast, but we didn't really get too much into cybersecurity. So why is that even more important when you're talking about all these different temporary locations?
When you move computers outside a main office, things get a lot more complicated. So, historically, we would, install a firewall at the office and protect all the data and have a server, and everything's contained in this sphere. And now that people are moving their data everywhere, it becomes a lot more complicated. So, employees are working from multiple locations. Even if, they're working at a job site, they might also be working at a hotel or some type of coffee shop or something like that. And those mobile phones, those tablets, those laptops, they're accessing company data. And so this idea of an office perimeter or this fear of protection has kind of disappeared. The security perimeter has expanded to practically the whole internet, and we have to protect those devices differently because they contain sensitive company data, they contain access into sensitive company data, and certainly the risks increase exponentially when they leave the office.
Is the approach to setting up security for a field office the same as for remote work, or is there anything different about it?
It could be a little bit different, especially if you have like a construction trailer or some type of fixed location where those devices are. So if that's the case, then we can protect that location, with a company firewall and company-owned devices, and that works great. The issue is if you're not in a fixed location, if you have teams that are working out of their vehicles or working just generally in the field, and they're running on potentially public Wi-Fi or cellular service or some type of other connections, then you don't have the ability to protect them with company owned firewall. So that's where it becomes a little bit more of an issue, that you can't put a bubble around that office as well, especially what we find in these field offices, that they may be shared too. So if there's a job trailer, you might have a couple of different contractors working out of the same job trailer, using the same internet. So you can't lock it down quite as easily as you could as a corporate office.
Can you restrict what kind of data is available on these remote devices as opposed to what's like a main office?
That's a great question. So certainly access permissions are an essential part of it. You don't want, these users running around with full administrative rights on all your data. It's a huge risk. And so one of the first things that your IT department should do is ensure that these users have restricted access accounts to lock down, maybe even to the job that they have access to. So what we've done for some companies in the past is create different share sites for data for that specific job, and then the office team will push out, whether it's PDFs or different engineering files to those file shares. And so the job, the people at the job site only have access to the data that they absolutely need, and not their entire system. What makes that nice too, rather than having to give them access into like your CAD system or your full software, that they're only accessing what they need, and it's a little bit easier for them to find the data that they need rather than having to search around. So having separate SharePoint sites for specific jobs is a really nice way to limit the data they need. And the the data that they could get exposed to if something happens to that device or it gets stolen or things like that. So I do believe in that restriction down to just what they need is a good way to protect your data.
And what kind of risks are there when there are third parties coming in? If they, like you said, if they're using the same trailer, same Wi-Fi, how do you kind of account for that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest concerns would be like unsecured Wi-Fi, open access Wi-Fi without, good passwords or things like that. So, the data that's transmitted on the network could be exposed to the other devices on the network. And that's the other thing, like if you're on the same Wi-Fi system or same even hardline network and one of the other company's devices has some type of ransomware or malware or some other type of virus, it can affect the other devices on the same network. And if those devices also have access into maybe the corporate data, that ransomware or malware or virus can get back to the corporate network too. So that's our biggest concern is, being on the same network as other devices increases the protection requirements on your own company's devices because there's a good possibility that it will somebody will attempt to attack that if it's on a network with weak security.
I imagine that's probably also a risk for even non-remote offices if somebody's working with a lot of third-party vendors.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Is one of the things that we always do for companies is on their corporate network is have a guest Wi-Fi. So if you have, auditors or other companies coming in, or people that need access to the internet at your office, have a public Wi-Fi that's completely segregated from the rest of the network, and you can give out that Wi-Fi code, and people can get access to it, but it wouldn't give them ability to access the internal network at all. So that's something that's essential that we recommend that businesses do. And in a job trailer properly set up, you could do the same thing. So if let's say there's three companies working in this same job trailer, properly configured network would give, different Wi-Fi access to the different companies. And so there's no mixing of the network between the three companies. So usually you can have about a half a dozen different guest networks for most Wi-Fi systems, and they can be completely segregated, and there's no sharing of data. So I would recommend if you're in a shared environment like that, that you don't use the same Wi-Fi across the different companies that are sharing that network. That you segregate the different devices.
And if does that help protect if like if your vendor, if you're somebody you're working with gets hacked, will that protect you?
Yeah, so if it goes the same way. So a vendor going to an office, if there's viruses or malware on that company's network, then, your device is protected too. So, obviously there's always concern when you're connecting to a foreign network that you don't have the full security and there's a potential for some type of, breach into the device. So if you're really concerned about that, cellular hotspot or linking to your cellular phone is definitely the most secure way that you're not getting on somebody else's network. That's not always feasible. A lot of these job locations are where, maybe the internet's not great, the cellular service isn't great, and you need a higher speed connection than is capable over the cellular network. So, making sure that we lock down the endpoint is really important, and we set up the right firewalls and endpoint protection systems on those devices to have a very secure environment inside that single device.
Like that the internet is not working right, and so they connect to their own personal hotspot on their own personal phone. Is that a okay or a risk or?
I don't have as many issues with that because it's generally, the possibility of an infection from a personal cell phone is probably pretty low. I would say the only thing that might be an issue is if the employee, uses a lot of data, they might want a big reimbursement expense if they don't have unlimited data. So you might have to have a policy on that, and making sure that you're paying for the personal device too.
And so going to personal devices, if somebody, has their own personal like laptop, how do we approach that, or do we just say we can't use a personal device in this setup?
We definitely talked about bring your own device, BYOD, in the past, and it's always a concern of mine. So, BYOD, especially laptops or, desktop computers are a huge problem because you don't know what else they're being used for. And especially if you don't have the same security protections on those devices as the other computers on the network. So, a couple of options there. One of them is if they bring their own device, then you install the same security system on that device you would any other corporate device. And the corporation, the company, more or less owns that device from an IT perspective. Employee leaves, then you uninstall everything and give it back to the employee for their data. But you have to have the same constraints that you would on a corporate device. No administrative rights, that you have full security suite on it, and you also limit the access into the network, assuming that there might be some type of infection. So we've seen over the years personal devices cause havoc on corporate networks. It was a big deal during COVID because a lot of companies didn't have enough devices or laptops to send people home with. So they were using, the family computer to access the network. And then suddenly there's, attempted malware infections or ransomware coming from those remote devices. So it is a big concern. My recommendation always is to provide corporate company devices for your employees, especially for laptops. Not as concerned about, personal phones, mobile devices, because you can set up, enough protection using mobile device management or, through the Microsoft 365 protections to protect that data from getting back in. So really the biggest threat that I see is like personal laptops and, because you don't if you don't have control over it, then the risk of infection is pretty high.
And I imagine with people moving around a lot with this kind of work, that device loss might be more of a factor. So, how should a company handle that, and how do we handle it?
Yeah, so the first thing, if you have devices that are going out in the field or remote, is you want to have full disk encryption. That is one of the most essential parts of it. So if that device is stolen, lost, whatever it may be, that a person cannot access that data without user credentials. So having full device encryption is essential. Now, luckily on modern operating systems, if you're running Windows 11 Pro, or Mac OS, that is on by default, and so that is something that really helps out. So beyond having full device encryption is you want to have the ability to remote wipe or lock the device. So your IT department should be able to wipe that computer of all the company data if it ever becomes active again. So sometimes what happens is the device is sold or will never connect to the internet again, and a person that takes the device will just wipe it clean themselves and resell it. So but if it does ever connect back to the internet, you want to be able to remotely wipe it. If it does get stolen, your IT department should disable that user account or at least reset passwords remotely. The other thing is revoke active sessions. So what that means is that computer may have active sessions into the network. And if for some reason the person that stole the device or that got it might be able to figure out the password, if there's a potential. So resetting that password, but also revoking that active session. So if they do have that password, that it will log into the corporate network automatically. So the other thing I would say is you want to monitor that account activity for a while to see if that device ever comes back up online. So that's kind of the protocol that we would take is report the loss, disable the user access or reset passwords, revoke those active sessions, and then if it's gone for a while, remotely wipe or lock the device so that it never can access the network again, and all the data is removed from the device remotely, and then monitor that computer account for some time to see if it ever comes back online. Companies obviously want to get their computers back too. So if you can monitor it for a while, that's great. And I actually have a little bit of a story here. So we had a laptop that was stolen out of a vehicle. It was a smash and grab. They broke the window and grabbed a laptop out of one of our field trucks, and we reported it stolen to the police department. We filed a police report, which to do that you need to make sure that you have the serial number and information about the device. So having a good management system and inventory system is essential to be able to do that. They're going to ask you some specific information about the device, and if you don't have that, they're never going to find it. But surprisingly, we submitted this police report, and about a year later, we got a call from the local police department and said that they had found our laptop. It was part of a raid, and had been sold, and it was like at a pawn shop or something like that, and they found the device and they returned it to us. And so, you know, I
Wow.
never thought we'd ever see that device again, but that's an important part of the first step is, file a police report, and there's a possibility, I wouldn't say it's good, but there is a possibility that you'll see that device again.
Yeah, and that's true. I guess, expanding beyond field offices, everybody like us, since technicians now it's HVAC, it's, plumbing and landscaping and everything, contractors that they're all carrying a lot of times tablets or laptops and phones. And so I imagine that's, very important to keep an inventory on. Probably can get set down and left somewhere pretty easily.
Yeah, for sure. And if you don't know if you have an inventory at all, one of the things that stimulus can do is through our assessment. We'll talk about that. That's one of the questions that we have on our assessment is to look over what you have and that ability to know all your devices on your network. So if you don't know if you have that capability of knowing where these devices are, remote wiping the devices, managing that user access, you contact us. We'll do an assessment and talk to you about that. And there's a QR code that we have up on the screen, and feel free to scan that and have that conversation. So these are tools that we can help you see if you have right now, or help you implement if you don't have them currently.
Yeah, definitely. And, speaking of like, making an assessment, do you find that people are still saving a lot of important data just directly onto their own device instead of into a shared drive?
Yeah, that is a big concern that we still have, especially, field workers. They might, have big files that they're saving, and they just store them on the local device. And if that, device gets destroyed, they might lose their work, whether it's, Excel documents, Word documents, PDFs, drawings, things that they're working on, that could be lost. So one of the things that we often get requests for is to be able to back up these devices remotely. And we have tools to easily do that, to have full device backup and restoration if the device is stolen or lost or damaged to a point that it can't be used. So for these field employees, if you ever had that experience in your company, it's really unfortunate that device gets lost, and then you say, okay, well, we'll just all the data's in the cloud or on the share, and they're like, I saved everything to my desktop. And I'm sure there's people that are listening to this podcast that are thinking, yeah, I save everything to my desktop. Isn't that automatically backed up? And the answer is generally no, that you have to have another system to back up that device. So highly recommend, sharing it out to one of those cloud services like SharePoint, or, if you're using Box or Dropbox or something like that, save it in a shared location. And if you don't, if you got to have it on the local device, then full device backup is an essential part of it.
And as people are traveling around on a field office, we can set up Wi-Fi. But what if people are moving around a lot? How do you suggest that they handle getting connected?
I personally move around a lot. I use my cellular hotspot. 5G has really helped out with this because honestly, a 5G service for an individual user is generally sufficient for everything you want to do. So I recommend, and we do this for our team, is provide either some stipend for their personal phone so that they can use it and pay for their mobile data, or provide hotspots, or a device that has sufficient hotspot capabilities. So that's, I think today, if you're out in the field a lot, having that mobile device is great. The other option is, if you have people that are using tablets, you can get tablets with built-in hotspots, or built-in cellular. So that's a great option for field workers too.
We talked about, obviously using a shared drive, which would be a way you can share files, and I imagine there's software depending on the kind of business you're in. But how do we make sure employees aren't just texting and emailing data that they shouldn't have that easily accessible?
That is a tough problem. So, the texting issue, it's a policy you have to set up, and some training to say, we don't text data, we don't use like personal accounts. What we've seen a lot is people will, send it with their personal Gmail, or they have a personal Dropbox account or a personal Google Drive, and they're sharing it that way. And there's a couple of issues with it. One is it's a security issue that the data is leaving the business and not in a controlled environment, so you can ensure that that data is protected or encrypted or transmitted encrypted. The other thing about using personal communications like texting or personal Dropbox or personal email is if that employee leaves, then you may not have access to that data. We've had that instance that even in our own company that employees have attempted to use, they prefer Google Drive, and they want to use that, and we shut it down quickly and say, that if we're paying you for your time and we're paying you for your service, we need to own that information that you're doing. So it should be a policy inside your company that you don't allow employees to use those other types of systems. Now, what that means, though, is as a company, you have to provide a good way for your employees to work. So you don't want to have a hindrance to your employees so that they automatically go to something that's easier. So make it easy for your employees to use your internal systems, things like SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, some other type of secure document management system, so that they don't have to look for something else to make their life easier, because that's what happens. People want to get their job done, and they're going to find the easiest path to get it done. And if you're not providing that easy path, then they're going to find another way to do it. And the last thing you want to do is find out years down the road that your whole team is using Google Drive, and then the person that owned the account has left the company, and nobody can control the data or do anything with it, and then it's all gone, and you have to do a big transition. So it's just a policy thing, and you have to think about it strategically and make sure you set it up right.
And to wrap it up, the company owner kind of needs to assess if they've outgrown their current IT setup or if they need something else. Where should they start?
Think the first thing is ask what you have, whether you bring in a consultant like Stimulus to do an assessment, or you do it internally. Is find out what's going on, ask the questions. We've brought up some interesting things here. If you don't know how you're sharing data out there, ask those questions. Ask your employees how they're accessing the internet when they're on the job site, and gather that information, and you can make some decisions on changes you need to make. The other option is you can find a company, that an IT or MSP, that will help you through these things. So if you feel like you've outgrown your current setup, if you're working with the one, your single IT person that you've known for a while, but he's just not available or not cutting it or setting these things up right, have a third party assessment to come in and see what you don't know. There's a lot of things you may not know that are going on, and having a third party come in and look at it is, will open your eyes to maybe many things that you didn't realize that were going on.
All right. Well, thanks, Nathan. That was a lot of information about field offices that we might not think about. I will put the link to our assessment down in the description as well. So if you are just listening and don't see the QR code, you can get that as well.
I think we're a little bit more modern than we were 30 years ago, but it's an interesting thing to solve. So hopefully we can help you out and got you some good information today.
Yes, definitely. And thank you. And thanks everybody for listening or watching.